Stefan Molyneux debates animal rights. Or did he? What's up, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. I had been asked to talk about this so-called debate that Stefan Molyneux had with a vegan the other day. And this vegan, whom we all know and love, tried to engage Stefan in his vegan LaLa Land, which he yet again rejected. Well, he made the mistake of putting at least one foot in this vegan LaLa Land just for the hell of it, just for the sake of the argument, probably because he felt like ridiculing the vegan in question, and that's exactly what he did, so props to him. Be that as it may, this vegan that we all know and love, what he tried to do was reframe his failed, many times already debunked name the trait argument to include the non-aggression principle, something that Stefan Molyneux himself is familiar with and interested in, something that he supports. And because name the trait has no real application in real life, the vegan in question here, as he always does, has to drag you into his imagined, non-existent vegan LaLa Land. And if you accept this vegan LaLa Land as real, what you're essentially saying is that we live in LaLa Land, except we don't. So what he did, as he often does, always does, is created this impossible scenario and try to draw some kind of moral conclusions from this imagined world as they would apply to the real world, right? That's a fallacy in and of itself. But perhaps the most hilarious, hypocritical, and intellectually dishonest thing about this vegan's approach in this particular debate was the fact that in this case, this hypothetical scenario rested on the existence of a deity, a god, a wizard-like creature, basically the very concept that atheists, especially this one, so adamantly reject. Without this godlike being, in other words, his hypothetical world could not exist. He grounded this atheist himself. He grounded this so-called hypothetical world in the existence of God, something he believes doesn't exist. And no, he's not the type of atheist who doesn't believe God exists. He's the type of atheist who specifically believes that God doesn't exist. There's a big difference there. So if you believe that God doesn't exist, and you prove this by ridiculing people who have in other debates proposed a god-like, wizard-like deity, how do you all of a sudden assume the existence of this deity because it's necessary for the existence of your hypothetical example? And then try to say that you are intellectually honest. Now look, if you have two deists or theists or what have you, two people that believe in the existence of God, grounding their arguments in the existence of God, well, that's okay for them because they both agree that this is okay. But in this case, you had two atheists who don't believe that God exists. One of them definitely believes that God doesn't exist. The latter one grounding his argument for morality, essentially, in the existence of God. I mean, come on. That's completely and utterly intellectually dishonest. It's hypocritical, and it reveals a logical contradiction in this guy's ethical system, which he believes invalidates any moral ethical system. If there is an inherent contradiction in it, in his eyes, you lose the debate. So why is it okay for him to do this? Well, because he's vegan. So this vegan proposes these imaginary scenarios, LaLa Land, worlds, in order to try to prove something about the real world. And obviously, that's a fallacy. You can't do that. A hypothetical example is supposed to be based in, at the very least, limited evidence. You have to have some kind of evidence for the example that you're proposing, for the possibility of this sort of scenario. Morality, for people who don't believe in God, like the vegan in question here, is not grounded in presuppositions or something that we imagine. It's grounded in the real world. Now, hypothetical examples are used to determine what's moral and what isn't, but they have to be practical hypothetical examples. You could propose a desert island scenario, or putting this vegan in a room with a chimpanzee holding a gun. Oh, he'd show you exactly the kind of animal lover that he really is. Sentience though. Anyway, obviously we do use hypothetical scenarios to illustrate perhaps contradictions within your own ethical system, or we use these examples to determine what is or isn't moral. We don't necessarily have to experience rape. We don't necessarily have to talk about a rape that actually happened in order to determine whether or not that action was just or moral or whatever. We could just imagine someone getting raped in a particular scenario, right? Or a human being eating another human being on a deserted island. And we can talk about that because that's very much possible. That is something that could happen in the real world, which helps us determine what's ethical or what isn't ethical, just in case something like that perhaps happens. Or to try to get to the bottom of how we ground morality as individuals, right? We don't imagine some impossible creature that is human and isn't human at the same time and try to fit that into the world that we live in and let that creature, its existence, determine what's moral and what isn't moral. That's completely and utterly absurd. And this is what this guy does every single time. Because name the trait has no application in the real world, he has to imagine a scenario that's literally impossible. And yes, hypotheticals have to be possible, probable. They have to be realistic. They cannot be absurd, right? That doesn't mean that a hypothetical scenario had to have happened in the past or will happen in the future. It means that it has to be realistic. In other words, possible. In other words, not absurd. It has to be logical. If you're having a logical debate in which your goal is to reduce your opponent's position to absurdity, you cannot yourself be absurd, right? That's a standard you yourself set that most rational, logical people agree on, right? We cannot be absurd to try to determine what's moral in the real world, to determine that logically. That should make sense to everybody, right? So by proposing these absurd hypotheticals, you just reduced yourself to absurdity. And by your own standard, a standard that most logical, rational people agree to, you lost the debate. You lost the logical debate. You cannot be absurd in a logical debate. How is this so difficult to grasp? A little bit more about hypotheticals. A hypothetical is essentially a hypothesis. Now, what is a hypothesis? It's a proposed explanation for a phenomenon based in limited evidence. You have to have some sort of evidence that suggests this hypothesis, that this could be the solution to this problem, right? So if we conduct a study on some population and we see a correlation between longevity and gasoline consumption, well, maybe we could create a hypothesis that suggests that consuming gasoline lengthens your life. But as soon as we find some sort of mechanistic data, or we can explain how gasoline actually poisons people, that hypothesis can no longer stand. You can no longer have this hypothesis if you're being intellectually honest. Now, we have hypotheses in this world, in the scientific world specifically, that reject reality, and they are still being pushed by corrupt and intellectually dishonest scientists, right? They exist, but those people are intellectually dishonest, and they're full of crap. Their hypotheses are completely and utterly nonsense. They've been debunked many times over. They're absurd hypotheses. So unless you have some evidence for this non-human human being, unless you could show how this creature that you like to concoct, dear vegan, in all of your debates, unless you can show that it's possible to create this sort of a creature, well, your hypothesis is absurd. You cannot change human DNA drastically and dramatically and then suppose that whatever comes out of that is going to be human. Because the slightest changes to our DNA They're so deleterious that they tend to kill us, or at the very least make us sterile, and, well, nature takes its course and removes that sort of being, this genetic error, this DNA corruption out of the gene pool. Bye-bye. And that's kind of what Stefan Molyneux was talking about in this debate. Again, I'm not getting into the details. You could go listen to what they had to say, and if you could stand it, you're probably going to have a good laugh at the absurdity of this vegan. But I don't need to get into that because it's the same ish over and over and over again. It's these absurd hypotheticals, which aren't really hypotheticals at all because they're absurd. A hypothetical has to be logical, right? In a logical debate, whatever hypothetical you present ought to be logical, logically. But long story short, what this vegan does in his debates is presents the fallacy of reification, and he calls it a hypothetical. No, it's just a fallacy. Now, what is the fallacy of reification? This is from Wikipedia. Reification is a fallacy of ambiguity. When an abstraction, abstract belief, or hypothetical construct is treated as if it were a concrete real event or physical entity. In other words, it is the error of treating something that is not concrete, such as an idea, as a concrete thing, right? A non-human human being, or whatever human being with the cow brain, corrupted DNA, infected with the virus, blah, 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 all these things that could never happen. To treat that thing as a real thing, this completely and utterly imagined concept thing, as not only real, but also a human being still, despite the fact that you completely destroyed its DNA, that's completely and utterly absurd. You cannot do that. It is the fallacy of reification. So if your entire argument rests on a fallacy, and a concept that you yourself don't believe in the first place, like God, well then you're nothing but full of crap, and worthy of ridicule, alright? A hypothesis, a hypothetical example ought to be based in evidence, however limited. And if I can logically show that the hypothesis you're presenting is absurd, okay, then your entire argumentative strategy rests in absurdity, is based in absurdity. Thus, it cannot be logical. How is this so difficult to grasp for so many people out there? I will never understand, okay? But slap that V on it, and people will eat that shit up because, well, postmodernism. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a good day.